So we have Mal and we have Dr. Seya there. Is that correct?
I've always gone by Shay, and that makes
Okay.
things easier on everybody. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Perfect.
yeah.
Appreciate that. So the first question is open to either of the two of you, whoever would like to go first. Question one, how did you determine you wanted to pursue your professional area of interest? Was it always an interest or was there an aha moment? Or did your interest evolve over time? And whoever would like to go first can start us off.
Or you want to go first?
I would defer to you, Mel.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. But yeah, so I am in public health research now. I didn't even know that public health was a thing when I was at Davidson. It's become a lot more well known, I think, since then, in part, unfortunately, due to like the pandemic that's going on right now. But yeah, so mine kind of just happened by chance. I think a lot of people who kind of stumbled into public health, this is kind of their same path. But yeah, I was a poli-sci major. I didn't really know what I could do with that degree. So I kind of broadened my search when I was looking for jobs after graduation to other social science and research fields. And I actually got connected with another Davidson alum who told me all about her work at NORC, which is the organization that I work with now. And it sounded really, really interesting. So she referred me, and that's kind of how it happened.
Okay, cool. And then, so for me, I am a electrical engineering researcher as well. And I work for the U.S. Army, which I wasn't necessarily anticipating that was going to be where I landed. But I did know early on that I wanted to do engineering. So the question might be, well, then why'd you go to Davidson? Well, I also played football while I was at Davidson, and it greatly enjoyed my undergraduate experience. And so it wasn't until I was trying to figure out how I was going to do engineering and what kind of field of engineering I was going to go into. So I was a physics major at Davidson, and so I knew that physics would be a good sort of building block for engineering practices, but I didn't know which or how that was going to work. And then one of the classes I took was an electronics class with Professor Dan Boy. And at the same time, I was taking an electricity and magnetism class. And that was like the hardest class I've ever taken and the worst class I've ever taken. But the electronics class was like my favorite class ever. And so I had to figure out how to, deal with the fact that I was like, I want to do the electronics, but maybe not the theoretical part of it. And so that's kind of how I got into electrical engineering. And specifically what I work on now is chip design. So I work on integrated circuits and sort of designing the blueprints for those so that those get fabricated elsewhere. We test to make sure they work the way we want to. And the idea is for those technologies to eventually go to our warfighters, but generally it's I choose topics to work on that have sort of further reaching applicability, which is one of the cool things about what I get to do. But yeah, Dan Boy Electronics, that was the spark that put me on the path to electrical engineering, I think.
Very cool. I do have somewhat of a follow-up question for you there because I know, well, like you said, engineering is not really a thing at Davidson. You can kind of like do that 2-in-2 program. Did you follow that route, or did you do your 4 years at Davidson and then move on to more of a graduate?
So I went to Davidson completely determined to do that through it was either a 2-2 or a 3-2 program where you start off at Davidson for a number of years, and there were options were kind of George Washington or Wash U was an option. I think Columbia University was an option to get then a bachelor's in engineering as well, sort of ping pong. And I was 100% going to do that until I got to my junior year. And I was like, I'm not leaving. There's no way I'm leaving. I'll figure out another way to do this. I love Davidson too much to just up and leave midway through it. So I knew I was like, I'll find a way to be an engineer somehow, but I'm not leaving Davidson because it's too much fun.
Gotcha.
And then they had I think there was an opportunity to do like a 4-2 program. And I said, if I'm going to spend 6 years in school, ideally I wouldn't only have a bachelor's degree. So not doing that one. So that was my personal. So that's still a program that people are pushing. Sorry, I'm not voting for it. But yeah, Davidson's a lot of fun. So stay for 4 years is basically my advice. So.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then we'll go back to you, Mal, for the second one. What would you say is the most rewarding part about your job?
Yeah, I struggled to answer this question because there's a few that I find really rewarding. I think one is just knowing that you're kind of shaping the future direction of research in your field is really interesting. At least for my role, I've had the opportunity to work on things like developing research agendas. So then seeing, other funding opportunities that come out of that, or working on things that are about translating research to practice can be really interesting. It's also really rewarding when you're able to kind of support communities in meeting their goals, or lending kind of your expertise to community-based organizations, sometimes working to help them develop or improve their capacity to do kind of health-related or research work. For example, like developing case study reports that groups can use to highlight all the really wonderful work that they're doing, or advocate for additional funding, can be really rewarding.
Thank you. All right, Jay, same question to you. What do you think the most rewarding part is?
Sure. I mean, for me at least, it's kind of the not work part, which I think might be a little bit of a weird answer, but I found, at least when I was going through my doctorate program. So after I left Davidson, I did a year where I was at Charlotte Country Day School, and I believe they still have the what was that fellowship called? The Hearst Teaching Fellowship. I believe that's still a fellowship that exists, and it's a great opportunity because I had a lot of fun teaching physics and coaching football at Charlotte Country Day School. And then I went to graduate school in electrical engineering to work on my PhD. And as I was going through and as I was leaving, I was seeing where folks were going, and I was seeing the kind of hours and the kind of sort of stress that the work environments they were going into kind of created. And I also knew that my dad, who was also a researcher for the government, did not have that. I mean, he was at every sporting event I ever went or participated in, went to. He saw all my games, he saw all my concerts when I was in band in middle school and stuff, right? So I was like, so there's a way to do this and, have a family and not be super stressed out. And so that for me now is sort of what's become one of the great things, is that I get to work on things that I think are really important, and I get to work on them from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. and then I get to stop working on them and then do the rest of my life. And work-life balance is something that I learned a lot about at Davidson, and I'm glad that that's continued to be a part of my life, since.
Where were you earlier? We did an RLO training on work-life balance, and we could have used that same sentiment then.
Yeah, man. It's just not like, I don't know. So a lot of people who do chip design end up going to work at companies like Intel, or on the chip research side of Google that no one ever hears about, because those people they're never allowed to leave, or they're never allowed to tell anyone what they're working on, basically. And so I just didn't want that for myself. And a lot of people throw themselves into their work and love doing it, and great work comes out of that. And I just was not one of those people. I wanted to have both. So I'm really excited and happy about that aspect.
Nice. Definitely a different perspective to think through. All right, so we went with rewarding. Now we're going to go through what is the most challenging thing about your job.
I can. Well, this after hearing Shay's response to the last one, I was going to say maintaining a healthy work-life balance was the most challenging aspect of my job. So yeah, maybe I'll go into electrical engineering. But yeah, it's just, the time management and kind of competing priorities. I'm always juggling a lot of different projects at the same time. And sometimes the deadlines just converge in a way that is not ideal. So a lot of switching gears between different tasks and projects, which on the one hand just keeps things really exciting and interesting, and you don't ever feel like you're kind of working on the same thing, but it can be a little bit difficult to kind of juggle all the different aspects. So yeah.
Did you see that increase? I'm assuming yes, but did you see the increase this past year with pandemia ruling this?
Yes. Well, I was actually working remotely since 2016. I came out to Seattle, where I'm based now. So I used to be based in the Bethesda, Maryland office with my company. And then I moved out here to pursue my Master's of Public Health at the University of Washington in 2016. So I worked remotely while I was in school, which I have different feedback about that if anybody's interested in learning about that. And so I've been working remotely, so I didn't have to deal with kind of that switch that everybody, I feel like, had to deal with when the pandemic started. But still, I would say, we do a lot of public health research. We're working on a lot of different contact tracing efforts and things like that. So we've actually, the workload has increased for a lot of people at my organization, and especially within the public health department, which is where I work. So yeah, I would say it's gotten a little bit more challenging. And I think too, just as you kind of progress through a career and you're taking on additional responsibility, I think it can get more and more challenging to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and maintaining a healthy work-life balance. So I think that some of the progression was natural, and then maybe just a little accelerated by just being inundated with a lot of kind of pandemic related work.
Very fair. Shay, same question?
Yeah, biggest challenge. I would honestly piggyback off of what Mal said a little bit. So when you have when you're working in a field where you get the more professional degree, then all of a sudden, I feel like a lot of times it's a lot easier to work where you're given a task and then you do that task for work and then you get to go home, as opposed to being sort of, here's an effort that needs to be met and figure out the way to do it, figure out who you need to work with, figure out what you need to purchase and find ways to purchase that. And if that hasn't been done, you have to come up with all of the new logistics in order to do certain things, right? So a lot of times people talk about the exciting part of research being that it's never been done before. So that is interesting and fun from an academic perspective, but the logistical side of that is very challenging of figuring out how to do the work to get the new result, I would say is one of the most challenging things. And yeah, in my lab specifically, I would say that our role is the closest kind of role that's not in my lab that I can think of is honestly like an assistant professor at a research university. I mean, that's closest sort of to what I'm doing, where you have a bunch of different research projects, and you're trying to find funding for those projects, and you're trying to get either undergraduate or graduate students to potentially work with you, something that we may talk about later, to work on some of these projects, right? And so that sort of having that be sort of what the job is like without knowing that ahead of time ended up being pretty challenging, because what I thought I was going to be doing was being given a task to research and figure out, given a bunch of, experiments to basically do and work on those. And that is not the case whatsoever. So, that's definitely been a challenge and continues to be a challenge for me, at least.
Very nice. Well, not nice in the sense that I'm sure that's frustrating, but that's something good for students to think about, that trying to go that fully research route, which kind of leads us nicely into this next question of what are some of the different job search resources you might would recommend to students that are interested in your area of study? How might they start to progress into those roles? What would be some of those resources?
Who's going?
You can go.
Okay. So this actually, so Mal was saying that she struggled with rewards because she had so many rewarding things about her job. I struggled with this one. And I think in particular because my field isn't kind of one that you would be able to get into straight out of Davidson. And I think that kind of changes sort of that question for me slightly, right? So really what it is being able to find the education that's required. So I know I wanted to work on chips. I thought, like, when I did the electronics class, I was like, oh man, I want to build chips. Chip design's so cool. Turns out that you basically can't work on that unless you have a PhD, basically, which I didn't really know, again, until I started to get there. Now, that's not necessarily true. I think there are ways of doing it with engineering degrees. And so, you know, if you came out of school straight with a bachelor's in electrical engineering, then yes, you'd be able to go straight into working for Qualcomm or I don't know, what's another company, NVIDIA, companies like that you may have heard of, Intel. But in terms of kind of the route that I went, the next thing to do was figuring out where to go for graduate school, specifically in electrical engineering. And one interesting thing about electrical engineering that I didn't realize, again, until I was actually looking for it, is how broad that field is. So when you think of electrical engineering, I was thinking about computer chips, but the people who design the theory behind how antennas work are also electrical engineers, right? There's like no overlap there, right? There's literally zero overlap. I don't know anything about that. And so being judicious in researching what not schools have good reputations in engineering, but which professors work on the things that matter is huge. So my graduate school advisor is one of the best in chip design, and he's at UVA. That's where he teaches, which if you were University of Virginia, for people who don't know, and if you were looking for electrical engineering just generally, you probably would not think to look at the University of Virginia. So that's just one of those things it's much more, in electrical engineering, it is much more professor dependent than it is school dependent. So yeah, education for electrical engineering, for chip design specifically, education is paramount. And Davidson prepares you well to do those graduate level courses, I think. But Davidson will not be sufficient for you to just go straight into that field just because of how specialized it is. So
no, that definitely makes sense. And I really appreciate you saying to definitely do the research before you jump into a program, but it's not looking at necessarily the prestige behind the school that you're going into, but actually the people that are teaching you the classes.
Right.
I would stress that a lot as well. Mal, what about you from your perspective? Are there specific resources, or is it similar that you would need to go on for additional education?
I would say compared to that, getting into public health is like easy breezy, in part, especially just because public health encompasses so much. It's such a broad field, and there are so many different areas and factors that affect health. Like you could work on something, you know, housing is very tied to health, employment is very tied to health. Like I think you could just, in some ways it makes it challenging in a different way because it's so broad that, at least for me, I had a difficult time kind of, and still do have a difficult time kind of honing in on very specific areas that I'm interested in, just because everything is interesting to me. And there's just so much that goes into our health. So I would say, I found, like, in the times when I've been looking for different opportunities, I found like alum listservs to be really helpful because, again, just in a field as kind of broad as public health, I think there's a decent chance that you would encounter something that maybe you didn't even think was related to public health or weren't even sure that that would be a job in public health. And then reaching out to LinkedIn connections. I love talking to Davidson students. I love, talking to anyone about my job. I really enjoy that. And I think a lot of people in this field just understand how it can be kind of difficult to narrow down what you want to focus on. So I think people are really willing to chat with people. I think asking for informational interviews can be helpful. There are also a lot of different professional organizations that deal with public health, American Public Health Association. There's a Trust for America's Health, which is like a public health and policy advocacy and research organization. They have a nice listserv where you can kind of get to understand some of the like major players in the field. Also looking for opportunities at your local health department if you're interested in going into like more of public health practice as opposed to research. So yeah, I think you could just Google public health jobs and probably a lot would come up. But yeah. Oh, and I also, one thing that I found really helpful just for myself was just, especially when I was in grad school, pursuing a lot of different kind of internships or part-time jobs at different types of organizations to get some more kind of hands-on experience. And I always say, I think that no matter what, you taking a different kind of part-time role, internship, shorter term thing, it will either teach you that you are interested in it or something that you're not interested in. So I think it'll always give you some useful information. So that was really beneficial for me, kind of getting to see how things worked. I worked at a foundation, I worked at a health department, I've worked in academia, and I work at this nonprofit research institution. So just getting to know the different types of organizations and like what might be a good fit for you culturally, what type of tasks you enjoy working on, that to me was really invaluable.
Nice, thank you. I think I might record that and just have that be sent out to every student that I meet with, because that was beautifully summed up. I'm gonna do a shameless plug and say, also for career-related resources, come visit us in the Career Center. We're happy to help you with that process too. And then the last but not least, our final question is, what advice did you receive, or maybe some advice that you wish that you had received, that you would offer to our current students now that are interested in the field of study?
I can go if that's all right, Mel, since you just said a bunch. I would say, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. Basically, at least for the field of study that I personally wanted to go into, which was electrical engineering, there wasn't much of a blueprint for that at Davidson, and there still really isn't, I don't think. And so I could probably help with that. But you know, there was a lot more specialized information that I really needed to be really proficient at what I'm doing now. That just, and it's not, no fault to Davidson. I mean, there's just not electrical engineering at Davidson. So Davidson does a lot of things really well, and this specific field of study was not one of them. But I think Davidson, the physics department, MJB, Dr. Bologna, who is my advisor, who's like one of my favorite people on the planet. They gave me all the tools I needed to go figure out, to be able to learn, right? I've learned how to learn. But knowing ahead of time that there was more that I needed to learn before getting into the field would have been helpful for me. And I went to University of Virginia for grad school, ended up finishing, and I think am able now to do, I think I can do my job successfully now. But there was another program, I believe it's NC State's electrical engineering program, that they were like, if you didn't have an electrical engineering undergraduate degree, there are these courses that we're going to make you take before you can start the PhD program. And I wish I did that. I think about that like all the time whenever I run into something and I'm like, I don't really know how to do this. And I'm starting to research it myself. I'm like, oh man, when I saw that when I was, in 2012 or whenever that was, I was like, why would I take extra classes? That seems dumb. I don't want to do that. And I've been kicking myself for that every time I run into something that I don't quite understand. So yeah, and I've actually since then, done the online course thing for certain aspects that, I would have had the opportunity to get that straight from professors, 8 years ago, but didn't think that it would actually matter and be that important, and it ended up being that important. So, educational opportunities are not a waste of time, basically, I think is the advice that I wish I had gotten. And if it seems a little bit slower, then it still might save you a lot of headache in the future. So, yeah, that's my biggest lesson learned, I think.
Good point. Val?
Yeah. Well, I would say for public health in particular, the classes that I found most beneficial have been ones that have focused on really building skills. So not necessarily, although it can be really, interesting and beneficial to take courses that focus on particular content areas. I think those that focus on, building your skills in writing or data collection or analysis or familiarity with different analytic softwares and things like that, I think have been, those are the things that I tend to use the most in my day-to-day. So I would say kind of focusing on those, because you can always, of course, like learn about a particular topic. There's tons of free resources everywhere that you can do that. And then also I'd say like find a mentor who can help guide you and advocate for you. That was something that I felt like I definitely got a little bit more from my grad school experience. I am now working for my mentor at a part-time job, and she's just been really helpful in kind of teaching me like what's out there in the research field, what types of opportunities there are and everything like that. And yeah, just like be open to different topic areas and career paths, because you might really like something. And, there's some topics right now that I'm really, really passionate about in public health that I didn't even know existed before. And if you probably told me I would be really interested in public health systems like 10 years ago or whenever I graduated, I would have been like, that sounds very boring and dry. So yeah, I would just encourage you to kind of be open to different kind of topics and career paths too.
Awesome advice. Thank you. All right. So that essentially concludes the panel portion of tonight's event. We're now going to transition over to breakout rooms. So I'm going to turn it over to Kayla, who is the brains behind the breakout rooms, for her to sort of explain what's going to happen next. Okay.